Petrodollars are oiling the wheels of investment in the Middle East, and as the region looks at ways to diversify its energy mix by exploring renewable and nuclear energy sources, old favourites such as oil and gas continue to feature strongly in the contracts awarded and set to be awarded this year for the regional EPC contracting brigade. My name's Oscar Russo. You're listening to Construction Week Viewpoint, a brand new podcast series, and joining me again in the studio is Jumana Abdel Razak.
Good to be here.
So Jumana, we're talking about oil and gas mega projects today. It's a topic that we haven't really gone into a lot of detail recently in Construction Week, but I think the backdrop to oil and gas is really interesting at the moment. There's a lot of exciting developments.
Exactly. I think we've been talking a lot about diversification for the last couple of years, specifically this year. So oil and gas has basically taken a back seat to a lot of these other projects popping up all over the region, but they're still happening. And today we're just going to look at, what is going on with EPC contracts and oil and gas projects.
Exactly. And I think, like you said, we've spoken for a number of years about these diversification efforts, trying to diversify the energy mix. And we're looking at major projects in Saudi Arabia and the UAE building these really big solar energy plants. But oil is a really interesting sector. It continues to oil the wheels of investment in the Middle East. And I wanted to start by bringing in a tweet by one of my favorite people, US President Donald Trump, who
is interesting.
Never a dull moment with the Trump-nado. And in a tweet from Donald Trump with, spelling mistakes in it, a tweet that he sent in the early hours of the morning, he demanded that OPEC members, which includes the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait and Russia, do more to stabilize the oil market and bring down crude prices. At the moment, oil prices are around $75 per barrel, which is historically a lot lower than they used to be a couple of years ago. But OPEC countries have now decided to raise oil output by an indeterminate amount. And this is kind of a promising backdrop for EPC contractors, many of whom are at least partially reliant on kind of the black gold economy, reliant on the revenues that oil projects and oil and gas projects kind of provide for them.
Yes.
And I mean, even though they'll be producing their output and producing the oil output, that could potentially mean further projects down the line, I think.
I think there will always be projects. We're still in the Middle East. It's still a massive industry. There's still a lot of investment going on in it. And we're seeing it across all countries in the GCC. Yeah,
and Bahrain as well. They had a major discovery, didn't they?
Yes, Bahrain earlier this year found its largest oil field since it started producing crude in 1932. Bahrain, the smallest energy producer in the Persian Gulf at the moment, the smallest energy producer in the Arabian Gulf, discovered shale oil and natural gas in a deposit of the state's west coast, and it is understood to dwarf Bahrain's current reserves. The Bahrain News Agency reported earlier,
which is so it's obviously a very major oil find, and we're talking about one of the biggest oil reserves since it started producing crude in the 1930s, and while this oil hasn't been extracted yet, presumably one would be led to believe that this would pave the way for a number of oil and gas projects that could benefit contractors in the region.
It's definitely very promising for Bahrain and for projects in the sector going forward.
Exactly. And I think you're looking at the oil and gas sector, and it remains a kind of a dominant force. Certainly in 2017, the combined value of the around 361 active oil and gas projects in the GCC crossed the 331.4 billion mark in 2017. Now, Jumana, the construction projects of the GCC's oil and gas sector constitutes around 2% of all active projects in the region. But actually accounts for around 14% of the total estimated value. So while the volume of projects is smaller, the value is significantly high.
Definitely. And we've seen this across all different companies. So if we're going to look at some eye-catching projects of the last year, ADNOC and Aramco have been very active this year.
Very active. This was a really big project. Construction Week covered the story earlier this quarter. Now, ADNOC, who's the Abu Dhabi national oil company, and Saudi Aramco and a three-strong consortium of Indian oil giants signed what's called a framework deal to set up an oil and petrochemicals refinery in Western India. Now, this is an investment worth up to $44 billion.
So it's a massive investment. And we've seen a lot of collaboration with India over the last year, especially when it comes to refinery projects, when it comes to, awarding EPC contracts. It seems like there is still a lot going on, and it's expanding. So it's not something you see just regionally. It's going into other countries. There's a lot of partnerships still going on. It hasn't really slowed down as much as you might think.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point. And when you look at the collaboration as well, that can only be a good thing for the industry at large.
Yeah,
now,
definitely.
Regarding the ADNOC Aramco, an Indian consortium plant, a timeline for construction has not been set, and ADNOC would not disclose to CW if land for the refinery has already been acquired, or even what the next steps in the process might be for the mega project that is a major part of ADNOC's downstream investment.
Yes.
But what we know so far about this very kind of notable project in the oil and gas sector is that a new joint venture business called Ratnagiri Refining and Petrochemical Company was created following the framework agreement. Now, the joint venture company is a 50-50 JV. One portion of that 50% is owned by Saudi Aramco and ADNOC, whilst the other 50% is co-owned by the three Indian oil consortiums. Well, it's one consortium of three Indian companies. Yeah. And away from ADNOC and not so much Aramco, Jacobs, one of the kind of the US major project management and engineering companies, has continued its strong partnership with Saudi Arabia.
We definitely saw a lot of work with Jacobs in Saudi Arabia recently as well. It continues its strong commercial partnership with Saudi Arabia by winning a 3-year Saudi contract of an undisclosed value to work on Yasrif oil refinery in Saudi Arabia. So Jacobs will supply front-end engineering design, or FEED, which is procurement, construction management, commissioning support, and handover for a mix of Yasrif's projects.
Yeah, okay.
Jacobs will help get the infrastructure in place to ramp up oil production on the west coast of the kingdom very soon.
Okay, so that's obviously clearly exciting. And that ties back into kind of Donald Trump's tweet at the beginning about the need to kind of boost production.
Yeah,
because you're looking at other kind of oil countries as well, like Venezuela, where there is a lot of volatility and concern in the market at the moment. So some of the real stronghold markets like Saudi Arabia.
It's pretty stable markets at the moment.
Incredibly stable
with
market.
All the changes happening there. And it's still, you see a lot of development.
Which is why it's so
very
important
promising
for Saudi Arabia. Yeah. And obviously you're seeing contractors like Jacobs being very successful in the market. Another contractor that's doing well in kind of the Middle East is CPEM. Now, fine, it's a loss-making EPC powerhouse, albeit it's worth mentioning that it did narrow its loss considerably in its last financial report. CPEM won a $1.3 billion engineering and construction contract to build 4 offshore pipelines in the Middle East. Now, we don't know where these pipelines are. It didn't disclose the client or the location, but I mean, 1.3 billion is not to be sniffed at. It's a notable investment.
Still very big investments. It's still oil and gas at the end of the day. It's a massive industry, very huge sector. And I think it's just something that'll always keep going. You know, we've talked about Saudi Arabia. We've talked about, there's Bahrain as well. Oman also, there's a bit of a focus on oil and gas there, even though it's a bit of a, you'd say it's not as big a market as Saudi Arabia. Doesn't mean that nothing is happening there. It's actually pretty active.
That's a really interesting point, Jamal. And to go off on something of a tangent that hasn't been prepared for this, actually there was a report that came out over the weekend by BMI Research, which is a UK-based insight company. And they've said that real-time construction growth in Oman is set to grow faster than the regional average.
Yeah.
So I think construction growth in Oman is set to grow by around 10% between 2018 and 2019.
Yeah.
Whereas the regional average in the industry is around 7%.
Yeah, it's definitely a market to look at the moment. Oman's very interesting right now.
It's been driven by an increase in production of oil and gas. So if you're looking at Saudi Arabia increasing oil and gas production, Oman increasing oil and gas production, the knock-on effect of that is benefiting construction, which can only be a good thing.
That's definitely. If we're going to look at a couple of other examples, the Oman Oil Company laid the foundation stone for the Salalah liquefied petroleum gas. If we're going to look at other examples, in Oman specifically, the Oman Oil Company recently laid the foundation stone for the Salalah liquefied petroleum gas factory and the Salalah ammonium plants in April. So these are valued at $826 million. And the SLPG project will be developed in the Salalah Free Zone on approximately 20 hectares of land.
Wow, okay.
Yeah. So while LPG and condensate storage facilities will be built on around, I kept reading it. It's not working. So yeah, there's tons of projects happening right now in Oman, a lot of plants being developed. Same kind of things we're seeing across like Bahrain, Kuwait, as well as a very active market.
Yeah, very much so.
A lot of refineries are being built there, and they've been being built for years. So just so much is happening, and it's happening in all of the GCC countries.
Which is really exciting. And as we've mentioned before, the knock-on effect of that is potentially a very positive development for the industry. Now, looking ahead, planned and committed investment in the Middle East and North Africa energy projects will be below 1 trillion over the next 5 years. Now, this is according to the Arab Petroleum Investment Corporation, which claims total investment will hit 919 billion across MENA, which is around 4% below the figure experts predicted a year earlier.
Yeah.
Which is fine, but like we've said, there are still a number of kind of major projects going on. I think, like you said, Jumana, Saudi Arabia will be one of the countries leading the way there.
Yeah, definitely. But the uncertainty of reimposed sanctions on Iran also means that we could struggle to attract foreign investments.
Right, okay.
And according to Apricorp, According to Apricorp, a multinational development bank focused on energy projects, Saudi Arabia and the UAE collectively account for 38% of planned investments currently right now in the Middle East and North Africa.
Right.
So that's basically with about $149 billion and $72 billion respectively.
Okay, so that's quite a significant proportion then. When you're looking at the countries in the GCC, you've got the UAE and Saudi Arabia collectively responsible for just under 40% of the projects, which is pretty exciting. Now, I think the report as well also said that the private sector has a kind of an increasingly important role to play in financing energy projects such as oil and gas, which is kind of to help the government ease fiscal pressures. And you're looking at governments as well, like investing in non-oil sectors as well. So if the private sector can help with investment there, that's obviously a good development as well. And I keep going back to the point about it's a good step for the industry, but fundamentally it is.
Yeah, it's always kind of been the same, to be quite honest. There's always been a lot of private sector investment. It's something that's been happening for decades. And we mustn't forget that this is still the Middle East, and this is still going to be one of the biggest sectors in the region and, in the world. Oil and gas is still something that people are focused on. It hasn't gone away yet. Though we're diversifying, it's still something that people see that industries will still invest in the long term. It's not going anywhere anytime soon.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point to end it on. Oil and gas is here to stay. It's not going anywhere. While there are diversification efforts underway, oil and gas, like you said, Jumana, remains a mainstay of the industry, the construction sector.
Yes, definitely.
And an important part of the kind of like economic plans moving forward. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the latest episode of Construction Week Viewpoint. If there's an episode or a topic that you would like Jumana and I to discuss or look into, please do get in touch with us. Until then, thank you for listening and goodbye.
Goodbye.